starting with the quarterback and the people that we are starting this week.
Monday night, Sam Darnold, who was a stardom last week, had a great game, 5 touchdowns, nearly 35 fantasy points. He has now scored 19 plus points in 4 straight games, including 21 against this week's opponent, the Bears. And remember when we were talking about the Bears being a tough defense when it came to quarterbacks? Well, not lately. Since week 11, 3 have scored over 20 against them. So we started talking about that, and it went the other way. Bo Nix this week, fresh off a bye, going up against the Colts in the Peyton Manning Bowl. Nix has scored 17 plus points in 6 of his last 9, including 4 with over 20. And the Colts defense has allowed 7 quarterbacks to beat them for more than 17 points, including Trevor Lawrence, Drake May, and CJ Stroud.
Who are we sitting at quarterback?
Yeah, Russell's an easy one. No George Pickens. He's got the Eagles. They've allowed the 4th fewest points per game to quarterbacks. So Russ is very hard to play in a traditional 1 quarterback league. And then Anthony Richardson, the game before the bye was good. He had over 21 fantasy points, but I just don't trust him in a traditional 1 quarterback league against the Broncos in Mile High.
Yeah.
On their home field, quarterbacks are averaging 14.5 points per game as the opposition. So Richardson is really only a super flex option for me.
Tell me who I'm starting at running back.
We'll start with Chuba Hubbard, who I didn't like him last week. I told you probably got to play him. You don't have to like it. Well, you probably got to play him, and you did like it. He had a very good game, and now he's got my beloved Dallas Cowboys in a game where both running backs should be in starting lineups, both Chuba Hubbard and Rico Dowdle. Remember, for the Panthers now, no Jonathan Brooks. This is an all Chuba Hubbard game for the Panthers, who are favored for the first time in 2 years. Nice job, Dallas. Brian Robinson Jr., Lindsay mentioned him a little bit earlier on. Last game before the bye, almost 18 fantasy points. Of course, Austin Eckler is on the injured reserve list. And I love the matchup against the Saints. They've allowed the 8th most fantasy points per game and over 5 yards per rush to running backs. So Robinson Jr. is a very nice RB2.
Who are we sitting?
DeAndre Swift, his stats have just been awful lately. Single digits in 3 straight and 4 of his last 5. He had 9.5 points in his last game against this week's opponent, the Vikings. They've allowed the 4th fewest points per game to running backs also. This is not a good matchup. Sit DeAndre Swift. And I'd say beware Tyrone Tracy this week. I'm not saying that you have to sit him because he's been really good. But this is the Ravens. They're coming off a bye. Game script could be an issue.
Could be.
Only allowed 6 running backs to score 15 or more points this year. So just keep this in mind. Tracy's probably going to be an RB2 flex, but the numbers may not be great.
Wide receivers, who are we starting? One of them we mentioned earlier who was not spotted at practice.
So obviously keep in mind that I could make this Devontae Adams or Garrett Wilson. They're both going to be startable this week. But Adams has started to get hot. 43.5 combined points in his last 2 games, and he's seen 23 targets in those games. So he and Aaron Rodgers have certainly rekindled that fantasy magic they had together in Green Bay. Now you got the Jags, 4th most points per game allowed to wide receivers, including the 4th most points per game allowed to the perimeter. So Adams and Garrett Wilson, despite their inconsistencies throughout the course of the year, are very good plays. And the same goes for DJ Moore. You know, he had 10 points last week. It wasn't great, but he scored 23 plus in his previous 2 games, including almost 27 against the Vikings. And their defense has really not been great against the perimeter. 3rd most points per game allowed since week 7. So DJ Moore is a fantasy starter.
Yep. Who is sitting at wide receiver?
Yeah, Michael Pittman Jr., I'd said that he is Anthony Richardson's number 1 in terms of first read rate, but he's not been good. I mean, he's failed to finish with double digits in all but one of his last 6 games. He's averaging fewer than 10 points per game on the season. Josh Downs is looking like he could be back this week. So even though Denver can be beaten by perimeter receivers, I don't think Michael Pittman Jr. is going to get there this week. So I would keep him on the sidelines. And then another AFC South wide receiver, Tank Dell. He's been held to single digits in 3 of his last 4 games. He's averaging 9.3 points per game on the season. Really a disappointment, especially when Stephon Diggs went down. We thought we'd get more Tank, and we have not. He's got the Dolphins this week. They've allowed the 4th fewest points per game to the receiver position. Unless you are in dire straits, Tank Dell should be on the bench.
Tight end. We already told you earlier that you Are probably gonna have to put David Njoku on the bench. Mary Kay Cabot
Yep.
telling us that he is unlikely to play this week. So we just lost one, which makes the sits maybe a little bit harder to sit, but we'll get to that. What about the starts?
Yeah, Jake Ferguson. I know he wasn't great last week, but this is a really good matchup against the Panthers. No team has allowed more fantasy points at tight ends
To
all
everyone.
year, and only one team has allowed more points to tight ends since week 7. Carolina's given up 10 or more points to 9 tight ends, and 5 have hit that mark since week 8. So Ferguson should be in your starting lineup. And then Tucker Kraft, who had a good stat line last week despite playing against a tough defense in Detroit. When you look at the numbers, though, at least 10.6 points in 3 straight games. He's got Seattle this week. They've allowed the 12th most points per game to tight ends, and 8 players at the position have beaten them for more than 9 points. And I think 9 point is the mark where you're thinking, okay, that's not a bad stat line from a tight end.
Give me some context here for these sits.
Well, Kyle Pitts has maybe got one of the 5 best matchups among tight ends this week. I can't play him. I can't. Over the last 5 weeks, 2.4 or fewer points 3 times, 3.2 points per game. He played 58 snaps last week, which is good. He saw 6 targets last week, which is good. It still did not equate to fantasy production. And in the first week of the fantasy playoffs, unless I am desperate, unless I have David Njoku and now I have to play Pitts, for example, I can't trust him. I can't trust him. Very, very hard player to start, even when the matchup is right. And then Dalton Kincaid, Lindsay talked about it a little bit earlier on the show. It looks like he's going to be back this week, full participation. And yes, people are going to have to play him. But Dalton Kincaid has not been great this year.
No.
And the Lions have allowed the fewest points per game to tight ends, and only 2, including Tucker Kraft, have beaten them for double digits. And the highest score that they've given up to a fantasy tight end this year is 13.1 points. That was Kraft last week. So Kincaid is a bit of a risk. I know you're probably going to have to play him, but this is a bad matchup against Detroit.